I'd like to welcome everyone to Utah's only statewide conference focusing entirely on our state's history. Our conference theme, of course, is Local Matters, interweaving historical threads of community. And in keeping with the sentiment famously uttered by former Speaker of the U.S. House Tip O'Neill, just like politics, all history is local. I want to take a moment and apologize for the sound issue that we had earlier in the day. We're in the process of resolving that for the afternoon sessions when the Great Hall is sectioned in half, so we do apologize for that, and we're working through those technical difficulties. The next thing that I want to make sure we do is I really do have the distinct honor of recognizing a couple of distinguished individuals who are with us today. Jill Remington Love, who is our Executive Director of the Department of Heritage and Arts, and Carrie Nakamura, if the two of you wouldn't mind standing up, who is our Associate Director of the department. We're really delighted that you would join us today. Today we're examining the many strands that create the fabric of communities, such as festivals, buildings, characters in our midst, institutions, and the arts. I hope you found the morning sessions engaging, and I can guarantee you that today's keynote address and our afternoon sessions should be equally outstanding. I want to thank our major conference underwriters. In fact, if you take a moment to open your program to pages 4 and 5, their logos are all up there. If you know anyone associated with these organizations, please take a moment and any time to thank them for the support that they provide for the conference. We simply couldn't do it without their generous contributions. I also want to thank our staff and volunteers for their involvement and dedication to the conference. We could not simply do this without your support. So please continue to enjoy your lunch during the program, but I do want to invite Brad Westwood, who's the Director of the Utah Division of State History, to join me up at the podium. He's going to give us an update on some of the division's work. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we have someone much more interesting to hear, so I'll be quick. But what I want to describe is the amazing accomplishments that State History and the State Historical Society has done in the last year. First thing I want to say is this would not be possible for about 32 devoted, full, part-time staff, interns who love history, who have focused their careers and interest to make the history of Utah come alive and something that we can all enjoy. So I want to thank, and now may I ask the staff of State History who are with us and everyone involved to stand up, please, so we can recognize you. Thank you, colleagues. For over 120 years, the State Historical Society has preserved and shared Utah's history. This effort has been complemented for the last 50 years by the Utah Division of State History. We make Utah history accessible, relevant, and integral to Utah's future and to the state's economy and culture, both to individuals and to communities. State history today is a clearinghouse. We are conveners of all things regarding Utah's public history. I'd like to share just a few wonderful accomplishments this year. The staff has completed the Salt Lake Tribune Photo Collection Digitization Project, making available 171,000 photographs of major events from the 1930s to the 1960s. The Salt Lake Tribune has more images in its archive, and State History is working hard to reattach and assemble this wonderful, massive photo archives. But thank you, staff, for all the hard work putting this wonderful digital archives together. After nearly 4 years of work, the newly publicized library catalog has come online with 64,000 books, journals, and manuscripts. We also have brought online our artifact database, which we hope you'll go to the website and look at. We have identified 32,000 objects related to Utah's history over a 4-year, 6-phase process, and just now we're getting just a few of them online. We would love it if you would go and look and see what those artifacts can tell you about Utah. We provided artifacts for, we now have 675,000 burial records for your review online. State History has the statutory responsibility to hold the database for all cemeteries, government, private, and military. We provided artifacts for events celebrating the state capital's 100th anniversary, women serving in the military, and World War I Remembrance Exhibit. If you're aware of World War I related events or anyone seeking funds for research or activities, contact us. The legislature has given us funds to pursue and celebrate and acknowledge the impact World War I has had on Utah. The Utah History Day program involves 6,300 4th to 12th grade students throughout the state. Ultimately, 57 qualified for a national competition in Washington, D.C. This program transformed young Utahns into researchers and deep critical thinkers. The context and the engagement of history makes a great learning opportunity for Utah's youth, and this program is growing and growing. In federal funds, we awarded over $177,000 in matching grants for 20 communities, generating more than $400,000 in historic preservation activities. We provided seed money for a $2 million restoration project. The 1899 Richard C. Watkins designed Spring City School, which now serves as a town hall. What a wonderful piece of architecture preserved. More than 5,000 visitors have enjoyed our exhibit, Utah Drawn, an exhibit of 40 rare maps of Utah that's now on at the state capitol on the 4th floor. The exhibit will continue till October 23rd. This is a rare opportunity to see original maps. It is very often one sees only digital versions. Here you will see the actual objects. We urge you for the next 3 weeks to go visit this exhibit at the Capitol. Over 3,000 Utahns participated in our Archaeology and Preservation Month, which is in May, with 20 counties helping us. State History is committed to equally telling Utah's both its archaeological story and its historical story. In the past year, nearly 500,000 Utahns have accessed our website resources. We recognize there's more and more that this is truly the front door for state history, and we hope you'll find these resources helpful. I'm so thankful for State History's dedicated staff, our interns, our board members, and partners who have made this a successful year for Utah and its history. In closing, I want to announce next year's conference theme and the annual statewide theme. So, friends, I want you to start thinking about who wants to present and who should be a part of this conference next year. Our conference theme for 2018 is Transportation and Movement. More details will be found in the conference program in the back. This annual theme and conference will include the study of America's first transcontinental railroad. This is both a call for papers and presentations and documentaries and whatever else. It is a call for community recognition of the centrality of transportation and movement in Utah's history. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And now I'll turn the time back to Dina Blaze.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here today. I really have the best part of today. It's sort of my responsibility. I get to have the most fun here because it is truly my pleasure to present and announce the 2017 Utah State History's Outstanding Achievement Awards, which are given in recognition of sustained period of excellence. Today's awards are the culmination of study and a lot of conversation among the Board of State History, state history staff, as well as some key volunteers and many others. Our first Outstanding Achievement Award goes to Craig Call for his exceptional service and achievements in historic preservation in Utah County. Craig, can you come up and join me at the podium? If you have seen the more than 60 historic buildings in Provo's lively 3-block area centered around the intersection of University Avenue and Center Street, you can thank this guy. What is now loved and used by scores of businesses started with Craig in the early 1980s, when he bought and rehabilitated most of those buildings. Without his leadership, his business skills, his preservation acumen, much more of this area would have been razed. Craig also played a critical role in helping to preserve the main Brigham Young Academy building, which was saved from demolition, rehabilitated, and adapted for use as the Provo City Library and Community Center. Brigham Young Academy Square is one of Utah's most historically significant architectural centerpieces. Craig also served as the property rights ombudsman for the state of Utah from 1997 to 2007, where he assisted in the mediation and arbitration of several thousand land-related disputes. He also formed and led the Utah Land Use Institute to raise awareness and to facilitate decisions about zoning, historic preservation, and local land use, and where those things interconnect. Craig is an outstanding professional, a mentor, teacher, and colleague, but should be seen first and foremost as an outstanding leader in the field of historic preservation. There is no doubt that many communities would look very different if not for Craig. Please join me in honoring Craig Call with the Outstanding Achievement Award. Our next award recipient is Keep Yale-Crest, which stands for Keep Educating and Encouraging Preservation of Yale-Crest. Will the members of the Keep Yale-Crest organization join me up on stage? Keep Yale-Crest's mission is to help preserve and protect Salt Lake City's Yale-Crest neighborhood by providing advocacy, education, recognition, and the community history, landscape, and historic architecture. This nonprofit organization is comprised of volunteer residents from the neighborhood itself. It was created in response to character-altering development and the demolition of single-family homes in the neighborhood. The Yale-Crest neighborhood was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2007 and dates from the early 1900s. The organization's work includes walking tours, welcome to the neighborhood packets, a newsletter, frequent social media posts, the distribution of historic plaques, traditional building skills workshops, celebrations tied to historic milestones for the area, and of course outreach on the rehabilitation tax incentives that are available to property owners. Emeritus University of Utah professor Tom Carter has said, Keep Yale-Crest has provided a new model for doing incremental neighborhood preservation. Thanks to their efforts, the history of the neighborhood will endure. Please join me in honoring Keep Yale-Crest with an Outstanding Achievement Award.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Remember meeting with those? I know, so thank you.
Thank you. Our next Outstanding Achievement Award goes to Maureen Parker Smith. Maureen, can you join me on stage? Maureen has been a devoted member of the International Society of Daughters of Utah Pioneers, the DUP for short, for 40 plus years. She served on the DUP board for nearly 25 years and as president of the organization for nearly 7. During her tenure, she formed a partnership with the LDS Church Family History Department to digitize the DUP's very important manuscript collection, a truly visionary thing for DUP to do. Maureen has also led a constant charge for bringing in new members, advocated for local autonomy among the DUP's hundreds of companies and camps, which are scattered across Utah, the US, and Canada. And she served as a steadfast defender of this 115-year organization. She spent half her life buttressing the principles established in 1902 to document and celebrate the Euro-American LDS pioneers who arrived between 1847 and 1969, and established what would eventually be described as the Mormon Corridor, or Culture Region, that area loosely bordered by Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, and southern Idaho to the coast of California. Overseeing the DUP's, and this was mind-boggling when I read this, overseeing the DUP's approximately 600 monuments, 24,000 members, and 90 museums.
No,
Maureen?
there's 131.
Oh, I'm sorry, there's 100. Oh my God. The 131 museums. Oh my gosh, you must be exhausted. I should have had a chair for you to sit in. You have made your organization proud as the outgoing president of the International Society of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. Please join me in honoring Maureen Parker Smith with this Outstanding Achievement Award.
I've got a lot of good staff. I don't do it alone. I'm impressed.
The Utah State School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, or SITLA, as it's more commonly known, is our next Outstanding Achievement Award winner. Will those representing SITLA, will you all please come up to the stage and join me? We have Kevin Carter, who's the former executive director, and Kenny Wint, who is really started the archaeology program at SITLA. SITLA has demonstrated exceptional leadership in its long-term commitment to the archaeological and historic heritage of Utah, while balancing the needs of its beneficiaries, which of course are the public school children in the state of Utah. It has a stellar archaeological program and consistently proves willing to work pragmatically through all proposed undertakings, all the while working effectively with state, federal, and private partners. It's a model of cultural resource compliance from a state agency, very adept at balancing all those competing interests. For example, the use of covenants to protect archaeological resources on lands being sold to private individuals has been a successful model for long-range preservation of sites without inhibiting the real estate value of those lands. SITLA has shown a willingness to preserve and interpret some shining instances of archaeological and historic resources. Recent examples include Cave Towers and Shumway Cabin in San Juan County, the Spirit Railroad and Temple Mountain Rock art panels in Emery County, and the Great Hunt panel in 9 Mile Canyon. In the rare cases when impacts to significant archaeological resources are unavoidable, SITLA focuses on mitigation measures to recover important scientific data that would otherwise be lost. One recent example is the discovery at a site in Kanab that farming was practiced in Utah over 3,000 years ago, which is 1,000 years earlier than had previously been known. The entire staff of SITLA have earned this recognition for their active and ongoing stewardship of Utah's unique and deep heritage, and for their significant contributions to our understanding of Utah and the region's rich history, and prehistory. Please join me in honoring the staff of the Utah State School and Institutional Lands Administration. Thank you so much. Come over. Kenny just wants to introduce the rest of the SITLA staff that's here.
And say a very heartfelt thank you to the Board of State History, the Division of State History, and our friends in the Antiquities section. You guys are great partners. I'd like to introduce the rest of our archaeological team. If you guys would please stand. Joel Boomgarden, Lisa Beck, and Christine Curry. These guys are integrally important to the job we do, and I just wanted to take a second to recognize them. Also, two gentlemen that aren't here, our current director, Dave Ure, and, oh, is he? There he is,
yeah.
Director Ure. And my long-time boss and Deputy Director, Kim Christie. Thank you very much.
And for those who were at Stewardship Day down in 9 Mile Canyon would have had an opportunity to meet those folks from SITLA when they were doing their interpretation of the Great Hunt panel. Thank you. Our final Outstanding Achievement Award recipient is the Topaz Museum Board of Trustees. Jane Beckwith and those members of the Board of Trustees who are here, I'd like to invite you to join me up at the podium, up on stage. As a high school teacher in the 1980s, Jane Beckwith brought the Topaz internment camp into the public spotlight, with an oral history project where journalism students interviewed local residents who were involved in various ways in the camp. This school project led to the formation of an advisory board, which evolved into the Topaz Museum Board of Trustees. In the 1990s, the board acquired and restored a recreation hall building from the camp, which has become the centerpiece of the current Topaz Museum. A multi-year effort to raise funds resulted in the acquisition of all but 6 acres of the original 640-acre Topaz site. Thousands of records and artifacts related to the Topaz story have been obtained and cataloged. In 2007, the National Park Service designated the Topaz site as a National Historic Landmark, which is one of only 14 such landmarks in the state of Utah. The Topaz Museum building was constructed in 2015 and the permanent exhibit installed earlier this year, and the official grand opening ceremony was held this summer. Amy Cole with the National Park Service has said, "The establishment of the Topaz Museum is a testament to the many volunteer hours and contributions made by former Japanese American incarcerees and organizations. The Topaz Museum Board, the town of Delta, the many community hours, and of course, Jane Beckwith. Her endless commitment to keeping the Japanese American incarceration history alive has contributed to educating the public on this significant history so it is never forgotten." The Topaz story is a unique chapter in Utah's history, and its significance cannot be overstated. Please join me as we honor Jane Beckwith and the Topaz Museum Board with our final Outstanding Achievement Award.
I'd just like to say their names: Lorley Draper, Lance Atkinson, who was actually in my first class that started working on this, Scott Bassett, I'm kind of losing my voice, and Rick Okabe. So there are other board members, but they weren't able to come today. So please come to the museum. It's only 125 miles away.
just a second. I just wanted to take a moment. We wanted to take a moment and acknowledge the longtime supporter and Topaz Museum board member Grace Oshta, who recently passed away at the age of 92. We plan to welcome her to the stage to be among her colleagues and friends in receiving this award. And we're saddened to learn of her passing. We deeply regret your loss. If we could just take one more moment and just give all of our award winners our most sincere and sincere applause and gratitude for the achievement that they've brought to the Utah history. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Ken Verdoia. Ken Verdoia is a living institution. For 35 years, he served the people of Utah through KUED, producing 25 documentaries that explored historic, social, and political themes. His work includes Utah, the Struggle for Statehood, Shadow of Hope, Skull Valley, Joe Hill, as well as the statewide election collaboration with public broadcasters Vote Utah. An honors graduate of San Jose State University in California, Ken also studied at the University of Utah, the University of North Carolina. We'll have a conversation about the NC State issue later. And Cambridge University in England. He has received more than 100 regional, national, and international awards for broadcast and journalistic excellence. In 1997, his record of exceptional service to the people of Utah was recognized with the Governor's Award for Outstanding Career Achievement by the Utah Humanities Council. In 2003, he was inducted into the Silver Circle by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences for lifetime broadcast achievement. And in 2007, he received the American Library Association's Gordon Conable Award for the defense of freedom of information. His groundbreaking approach to political coverage was honored with the Governor's Award for Public Service from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. And that work is used as a demonstration project by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to train other public broadcasters in exceptional public service. He's received 29 regional Emmy Awards for excellence in documentary production, writing, public affairs, and investigative reporting. And we are indeed very, very lucky to have you today. Please join me in welcoming Ken Verdoia. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to join you today. And this is not so much an appearance as it is reconnecting with a bunch of really good old friends. And I've worked my way through the crowd and seen so many people that have been so important and pivotal in my career that it's like you invited me over to have a glass of lemonade in the backyard on a nice summer's day. It's good to be with you. I really celebrate this moment, not only because I love to stand with Brad in his stewardship of the State Division of History, which I think has been masterful and so important to preserving Utah's history, but also for the theme of this year's presentation, this conference. The locality of history is at the very heart of my work, a work which I'll try to explain over the next few minutes. But this ability to speak before you gives me an opportunity to do three things that are really important at this stage of my non-career. First is to offer an apology, and I'll give you an explanation of that. The second is to offer some long overdue credit and gratitude. And well, the third attribute I'm going to put off for a little while. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. As has been noted, the past 35 years has afforded me an opportunity in public television to share stories about our nation, our region, and most passionately, our Utah experience. Over the course of nearly 30 documentaries, I was afforded multiple opportunities to explore people, place, and events that resonate in considering the story of who we are. When the dust settled, those documentaries had been viewed by in excess of 6 million people in the United States. And I'm grateful that those documentaries were viewed on the local public television station KUED, as well as the national PBS system. But more importantly, I was proud of their placement in 100 American colleges and universities coast to coast in curricula, and that they exist in more than 200 public libraries from coast to coast. And they also exist online, and it's kind of mind-numbing because when I started this career these many years ago, actually back in 1972, there was no one forecasting that you would be able to watch a 5-hour documentary when you flew from New York to London on your television or your phone, which was a television. So the media has changed dramatically over my career, and it's reshaped the way we tell stories, and it's reshaped the way we receive stories. In the process of doing the work, though, regardless of what platform it's on, the work got labeled. And one of the labels frequently put on the work, and one of the categories it was filed under was history. And in the process of identifying me in association with the work, I was labeled a historian, which is a great honor for someone to say, "You're a historian." That's, well, thank you very much. That's very kind. However, if I was a historian, I would be horrified that I had been admitted into the room. To the credentialed, here comes the apology, to the credentialed, published, respected, esteemed historians near and far, and specifically those of you in this room, I apologize for the cavalier label of my work as history. And I should point out that I have never asked anyone to include historian in any form of introduction. I am, first and last, a journalist. My definition of my responsible role is to help a contemporary audience understand complex issues likely to impact their individual lives, their communities, and their nation. And this explains my very short stay in television news in the 1970s. Because complexity is not at home in television news, and depth certainly does not exist in television news. But for a deliriously wonderful period of time, I was allowed to work in the wonderland of public television. And over more than 24 documentaries, I was working as a journalist from a very simple premise. This is where we are. How did we get here? How did we evolve politically, socially, culturally, to the point we find ourselves today? Even if government decision makers did not acknowledge the importance of what had gone before, and believe me, they did not, I could readily identify how all that had gone before was shaping the very issues they were voting on that day. Sometimes the premise of tracing today back to the past is simple. You see a statue standing in a park, and you wonder, who was that person? Why was it so important? And now with all the dialogue playing out in our society about why statues get erected, we should stop and think about who we honor and who is recognized and what was their time like. If a political movement is holding sway right now, what were the events in the past that allowed this political movement to form and then eventually hold sway with a voting bloc, be it locally, statewide, regionally, or nationally? If a folk singer picks up a guitar and sings, "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me," who is Joe Hill? No, not in the song, not as a cartoon character, not as a poster figure, but who was Joe Hill in his own words as he walked the street? And what were the words he shared? And why were those words important? And why did he sing them instead of write them? And what was the human condition he was talking about? And does it have enduring relevance to you and I today? Sometimes the asking of such simple questions launched me on journeys I could not imagine. Journeys I did not forecast, and journeys that I did not sufficiently pack for. I was fortunate to produce a documentary, as previously mentioned, on Utah's path to statehood to recognize the 100th anniversary of Utah's admission. That documentary started as a rough idea that we would do a 5-minute video piece on a weekly program that I hosted on public television. But as I started to do my job as a journalist, consulting a variety of sources, turning pages of letters, of diaries, of journals, of news accounts, reading histories of the time and place, a deeper, richer, more complex story presented itself to me. A story I felt had to be told if the state were truly to appreciate the unique and very, very troubled path to statehood of Utah. So I would trace back and try to understand that journey. And my first step was to identify and then read what I thought were the 20 essential histories of Utah of that time period that existed in that time. This goes all the way back to Bancroft in the 19th century and other writers of the time, all the way through Arrington into the mid-20th century, to immerse myself in those lessons, and then to use them as guideposts to go to the original sources, to find the letters of Martha Spence Haywood, to visit with the diaries, the journals, and the news accounts of that time, to better understand the living and breathing of the men and women who were living those issues in real time. The project grew. It was no longer 5 minutes. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, it had become 5 hours. A remarkable team came together to work on that, all because of a great visionary executive that existed in public television by the name of Fred Esplin, who said, "Tell the story you believe needs to be told." Let me tell you, folks, that doesn't exist in the media in 2017. It does not. The project grew and grew and grew, and quite literally, we moved. I so admire Brad pointing out that so many images now, photographic images, are now digitally available through the Utah State Division of History and the Utah State Historical Society. They didn't exist 25 years ago, so we literally moved into the photo archives. Is Susan Whetstone here? Susan was terrified at seeing us each and every day. I think I had a cot set up for 6 months as we tried to find the visual that would correspond with the storyline that was emerging to tell the story of Utah's journey to statehood. Susan was remarkable. More about her in a minute. Utah, the Struggle for Statehood proved to be the most watched, locally produced public television documentary of its era. Not just in Utah. In Utah, it had the largest percentage of a viewing audience of any public television station in the United States. People contacted us from New York, California, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, Montana, Washington State, Oregon, Hawaii. How can we tell this story in our setting? And I said, well, get 3 years and work 80 hours a week, and you may get there. Click. I'm not a historian. Oh, by the way, and then the best part of Utah, the Struggle for Statehood, it gets repurposed and is put to use through the Utah State Office of Education in public school settings to help share the story at an age-appropriate level with students in Utah. Now, I'm not a historian. I did not set out and say, someday I want to craft a public school teaching aid for history. That wasn't the intent. To go back to what I was a reporter chasing a story. When I studied briefly in England, and I always point out that it was very brief, I was not an important academic. I was a tourist who basically hung around Cambridge University longer than the dons were comfortable with. But when I studied there, I had a very interesting educational experience. We would attend classes, and our professors were these legendary figures, and they would hold forth about their thoughts of the great issues of the world. Had nothing to do with the curriculum, but they would talk great thoughts, and they would share, and they would ruminate. The real heavy lifting of the learning would come outside of the classroom, where you would meet with a specialized scholar and they would start your study by saying, you're going to answer one simple question. One simple question. For me, the simple question was, what is the salient feature of British common law most important to the lives of the people? Simple question, right? The scholar gives me 15 books to read, sends me away. He says, condense them and come back. Condense them and come back. This keeps going on every 2 weeks. I'm going, I'm writing, I'm coming back. He's reviewing, he's commenting. I'm adding. My manuscript is getting big and weighty. And at some magical moment, he tells me to stop reading. And he tells me to take those 50 pages that I've written and reduce them to 20. But in the process, do not lose any element of your essential understanding of the answer to your question. I said, well, this is impossible. He says, but you're going to do it anyway. Go for 2 weeks, come back, and he says, this is progress. You're going to reduce the 20 pages to 10 pages. And you're not going to lose one element of your essential understanding of the answer to your question. Go away 2 weeks later, and guess what? He says, you're now going to reduce it to 5 pages. Through this process, the 50 pages becoming 5 pages, it helped me crystallize a well-reasoned and well-researched answer to that simple question. But the sheer enormity of all that I experienced had immersed me in different thought, different analysis, different source material that I was then charged with putting together into essential values that I wanted to share with others. In its purest sense, this is what the best journalism should be. A reporter immerses themselves in volumes of fact, observation, differing opinion, and thought, all of which requires their thoughtful conveyance of the essence of their findings. Don't waste too much time looking for this in the contemporary media. But this is what journalists should be doing every day. It's the method I attempted to employ in Utah, the struggle for statehood, throwing myself by my collar into the deep end, doing my best to tread water and get out and then to convey to people, rank and file Utahns, what I experienced, what I had learned, and what had stayed with me. Now, every story that I've experienced along the way has had its own unique starting point. A case in point. I used to use the Brigham Young statue when it was on Main Street in South Temple, kind of there in the center of the intersection. I used it as a way of giving directions, and I never gave it a second thought, even though I was living in the city. One snowy night, I literally am standing at that corner and I look up and the light is hitting Brigham just right, from the Zion Bank building. It used to illuminate in that location. And I said to myself, who the heck are you? Why you, why here? Now, I don't want someone to tell me, well, he's such an important person. What puts you in the heart of this city? I would spend the next 2 years of my professional career trying to answer that question, with some really amazing lessons along the way, like diving into the Journal of Discourses and reading 900 pages of his oratorical skills, heavily edited, of course, but reading that and immersing myself on a person that could hold forth on everything on what parents should feed their 1-year-olds to the political dynamics of the Utah Territory's relationship with Washington, and everything in between. And then following his footsteps, from New England through Ohio to Illinois, across the plains and into this setting, interviewing people, reading his letters, reading his journals, and talking with some historians that would bring insight to me. Leonard Arrington, I'll talk about Leonard in a minute. Tom Alexander, so many important people. But one person I went back to and I talked to was Howard Lamar, who was the former president of Yale University and an extraordinary scholar in the history of the American West. And he said, the one thing you've got to keep in mind, and all else pales, for all the visionary leaders and empire builders that shaped the evolution and development of the American West, Brigham Young stands as the only architect whose vision is still readily apparent today in the settlement he shaped. Again, a key to understanding the shape of our current society was found in its evolution. Why are we physically in this spot? Why was a cane stuck in one location in 1847 that still shapes our life, our understanding, and our geographical bearings to this very day? And that's why I so readily identify with the theme of this conference. My work is the living embodiment of understanding intimate local stories as the basis for greater understanding. Telling those stories may appear to be history, but for me, its intent was journalism, to understand our contemporary setting by considering what has gone before. But if I flinched at the label of historian, I really wince when people call me a filmmaker. Now, there are those who are engaged in documentary production that wear that title very well. In public television, the documentary works of Ken Burns have a profound impact on our national understanding of pivotal eras, culture, and individuals. They've contributed to our national dialogue. And I'm asked almost daily to comment on Ken's recent epic documentary series on the Vietnam War. And my response is it has served as a national gathering point for reflection on one of the most contentious eras in 20th century American history. It is, by definition, emotional. It is, by definition, intimate. It celebrates the individual soul to be found in each quarter of that greater conflict. It has been criticized, but for me, it served an important purpose by bringing Americans together to consider pivotal moments of our shared past and leading to reflection and public dialogue. Ken Burns is an exceptional filmmaker. His craft and eye for detail speaks for itself. His work is a masterclass on how to assemble images and the spoken word. But it ain't me. I believe, let me tell you about a meeting that took place prior to this conference that kind of illustrates that. I met with representatives of the State Division of History, and they said, why don't you reserve some time during your talk to talk about your process as a filmmaker? And I think they were all kind of a little unsettled by the blank stare on my face. The truth of the matter is, I don't have a process. People tell me they can recognize a Ken Burns documentary in the first 10 seconds. Most times because it features a cannon. But they can recognize it instantaneously. I do not possess such a sense of style, nor am I artistic, nor am I necessarily particularly adept at the cinematic arts. I have an unschooled approach that is best characterized as the cinema genre of dogged pursuit. I follow a lead until I get it to the best of my ability, understand it enough so I can turn around and tell the story to someone else. Now, if I have that moment, and I called it my, I didn't know that moment. If I have that moment where I'm reading or researching and I come across something and say, wow, this really helps me understand what was playing out in the summer of 1890 when Wilford Woodruff was wrestling with the future of his church and plural marriage, there may be a good reason to believe someone else out there needs to know this story as well. Someone else would look at that and say, gee, I didn't know that. And in the knowing becomes better versed in understanding the place in which they live and the evolution of many issues that come from that point in time. I talked about Brigham Young and doing a documentary on the life of Brigham Young. In the many hours and days I spent in the archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was drawn to a series of letters that I did not know existed. And they were basically from Brigham Young to the leading figures of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroad. I am so excited to see the State Division of History turn its attention to the recognition of the anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad's completion next year. Why was I drawn to these letters? We were hoodwinked. we were played for an entire territory of suckers. And the biggest sucker of all was Brigham Young. Brigham thought he had negotiated at the highest levels of American business a series of contracts that would bring money to Mormon workers so that they would leave their farms, go to work on the grading project. His sons would administer these contracts, and manna would fall from heaven and bless the Latter-day Saints as they worked to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. The problem is, there was no money there. Not for the honest laborers, because all the money had been skimmed off the top and put in other people's pockets. And so when the great deed was done, Brigham is sending a series of letters back to California, back east, saying, when are we going to get paid? And basically not getting any responses. He sends his son back, who threatens that it's going to come to the knife. No response. Now, eventually it would be resolved. There would be some trade-offs. Accommodations would be met. But for one brief season, it all hung in the balance. Utah went into an economic depression because of the unpaid bills. Brigham's inbox was filled with people saying, when am I going to get paid? And it seriously shook confidence in his leadership at that time. Now, this is something I did not know. So I started doing the research, and I went into the voluminous story of the financial skullduggery of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which led me to David Hayward Vane, a great writer who was delivering Empire Express, which is a very, very good analysis of the Transcontinental Railroad and all the skullduggery that went on. What emerged was a documentary that I produced called Promontory. And it told the story of those last 6 months of construction and the uncertainty and the pain of what was going on behind the scenes beyond the slogans. Now, it offers an important perspective. It was a great national and local moment, but the story that I produced urged a contemporary audience to be mindful and look behind the slogans to understand the reality of big promises. As true as it was in 1869, so is it true right now. Watch what you're promised. The devil is always in the details. Now, other projects did not fall out of the sky as snow upon the statue of Brigham Young. In the early 1980s, I worked on a couple of documentaries which were born of conflicts going on in our world at that time that I felt needed fuller explanation. There was much discussion back then, legal action and congressional investigation into what responsibility the federal government had towards the health consequences of radioactive fallout, which fell on the Intermountain West as a consequence of Cold War nuclear weapons testing at the Nevada test site. I was in grad school at the time at the University of Utah, and I took a course in constitutional law from a great scholar by the name of Howard Ball. Great scholar, great writer, and Howard said, one of our class assignments, select a case from the federal government, it could be at any level, analyze its moving parts, and then hold forth, as only grad students can do, on the implications for what it means to the constitutional rights of the average citizen. So I selected the case of Bullock et al. Versus the United States from the 1950s. And I delved into it, and what we found was that this group of sheep ranchers from southern Utah had sued the federal government at the height of the nuclear weapons testing program in Nevada, arguing that their herds had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation and they had died and they were facing financial ruin. Their young attorney, Dan Bushnell, fresh out of law school, argued before Judge Sherman Christensen. And Sherman Christensen said, Mr. Bushnell, are you trying to tell me that you believe the federal government would come to my court and lie? And Dan Bushnell said, yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm trying to argue. And Sherman Christensen listened to the expert testimony. And in 1954, who had the expert testimony? The federal government. And all the experts were in the employ of the federal government. And what they testified was that It must have been malnutrition that killed the sheep. The sheep ranchers lost. But in analyzing that case and reading the transcript, I decided to track down the sheep ranchers that still survive. I found Dan Bushnell, now a named partner in Curtin, McConkie and Bushnell, very prestigious law firm in Salt Lake City in that era. I found the county agricultural agent who had done the autopsies on the sheep and had been standing there when an Atomic Energy Commission worker had gone by with a Geiger counter on an autopsy sheep, and it had pinned against the reading. All of these facts had been withheld from the trial back then. And more importantly, I used the Freedom of Information Act. And we uncovered dosimetry reports and statements of radiation levels that had been monitored by the AEC, branded top secret national security priority, and locked away at the time of the trial so they could not be introduced as evidence. The resulting documentary was called 30 Years to Justice. From his retirement, A. Sherman Christensen said, "A species of fraud has been perpetrated in my court, and I demand a retrial." This documentary led me to another documentary which looked at the health implications for uranium miners in the same era. For miners were going underground in Utah, Colorado, and Arizona to mine the uranium ore for the nuclear weapons testing program. Now that produced some great stories and some great episodes in I Love Lucy about people striking it rich, finding uranium and hitting it big in the penny stock frauds. But what happened is hundreds of miners went underground in unventilated mines, exposing themselves to high doses of radiation. Again, I used the Freedom of Information Act. And again, we pulled out dosimetry levels that showed the miners knowingly were exposed to levels 50, 100, and 500 times the federal health standard, day after day, 8-hour day after 8-hour day. I traveled through the Lukachukai Mountains on the Navajo Reservation, going to little crossroads villages. One village, there wasn't a single man over the age of 40 years of age. The women I interviewed said, "We are the village of widows." Where were the men? Dead of cancer. What was their occupation? Uranium miner. The use of the Freedom of Information Act was another tool that allowed me to open up my ability to tell a story. The Atomic Stampede, that documentary was called The Atomic Stampede, and 30 Years to Justice were both broadcast nationally by PBS. And it carried the message forward at a time that Congress was deliberating and voting on the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act, which would eventually attempt to make amends for these decades of secrecy and light regard for the well-being and health of the men and women in the United States, specifically in the Intermountain West. And there was no artistic process employed. We were scratching at the surface, trying to find what is the story. We were following dusty paths. We were chasing headstones of people who had died. And we were using the tools of reporters to find the information that would allow us to tell the story. Now, if you look for those two documentaries online, guess where you're going to find them? History. And that's how they're going to be labeled. And I'm proud of that. But our effort was to tell the story so that people in the 1980s could understand what was playing out in the context of human existence over those 30 years and why it was important for them to understand. Topaz, Jane Beckwith. Oh, my gosh. One of the history titles I'll never forget was born of a wrong turn in the desert and a clip from a Bay Area newspaper that was about 2 inches long. I was working on a story of the Intermountain Power Project, and I was driving outside of Delta attempting to find a long view to get the smokestacks of the Intermountain Power Project outside of Delta. Kind of an artsy shot. That's my only claim to art, is trying to find the long shot. So I get out there, and there was, at the time, a little green sign formed an arrow, and stenciled on it was the word topaz. Now, this is cool. They must have topaz stones out here. I'm going to drive down and take a look at it. Well, out at the end of this very dusty road, there was a small bicentennial monument that had been erected in 1976, acknowledging that the Central Utah War Relocation Center had in fact been in that location 30 years before. And I walked the land and I cut myself on barbed wire. And I found, as I was bending over trying to tend to my foot, I found a Montgomery Ward's mail order catalog from 1944, partially buried in the rangeland. And then as I looked up, I noticed there was the outline of rock gardens that still could be seen. I thought, I know nothing about Japanese American relocation, but I'm going to find out some more. As soon as I get back from vacation, went out to vacation at my folks' house in the San Francisco Bay Area. High school anniversary celebration reunion of the Topaz High School class of 1944. I went to the reunion. I met the men and women now in their 60s who had been teenagers back in 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45. A lot of them didn't want to talk with me. And I learned that war relocation was not an easy topic for many Nisei in the post-war years. But others did talk to me. And they shared powerful stories of their experience. And I came to understand that these people, American citizens by birth, had been relocated from the very area that I had been born in and that I called my hometown. The people that went to Utah from the San Francisco Bay Area were my neighbors. And I didn't know that. And I needed to know this story. And that investigation led me to Yoshiko Uchida, a great author who had written about her experiences, which led me to Minnie Okubo, an artist whose art talent had allowed her to leave Topaz when she was still younger to go back in New York and paint. It led me to David Tatsuno, a remarkable man, a University of California business graduate who was forced out of his employment and forced to shepherd his young family to the horse stalls of the Tanforan racetrack on the San Francisco Peninsula in knee-deep mud because of what he looked like. And then he went to Topaz. They took that family with them and he shepherded them. And as I talked with David Tatsuno, he said, "Hey, Ken, you want to see my home movies?" We did the first transfer to video of David Tatsuno's home movies, which are now in an honored collection of Americana in the Library of Congress and permanently preserved by the United States of America. That story, Topaz, never left me. To see the achievement of the Topaz Museum, breathtaking. All of this, an outgrowth of a wrong turn and a clip in a newspaper. I wish I could say I sat on a mountaintop, a lightning bolt struck nearby, and I was inspired to do something great. I was like, maybe your dog when you take him on a walk and he catches a scent, and I started dragging my television station in a direction, and it was a wondrous experience. One of the reasons I mentioned Topaz is because it brought me into contact with Leonard Arrington. Now, Leonard Arrington had written the first important examination of war relocation back in 1962. He called it The Price of Prejudice. And he'd examined war relocation from the standpoint of Utah. Now, I had interviewed Governor Herbert Ma. Governor Herbert Ma, at that time, very, very aged, but still adamant. I knew war relocation was wrong. It was the wrong thing to do to good American citizens, and they were robbed of everything, so I fought war relocation. And I was accepting that at face value. I interviewed Leonard Arrington, and afterwards he said, go to the state archives and read Governor Ma's correspondence, both incoming and outgoing. It may help you better understand what was playing out at that time. And I read the correspondence. And Governor Herbert Ma certainly opposed Japanese American relocation because he did not want the Japanese American citizens brought to Utah. Round them up, yeah, but don't bring them to my state. Let them be someone else's problems. well, eventually federal national security imperatives led to the establishment of the Central Utah War Relocation Site. But it taught me an important lesson. Always vet what a politician tells you. And thank goodness for the state archives and those original sources. Now, Leonard Arrington, let me talk about this briefly here. My time is getting away from me. Leonard Arrington was a great man for many, many reasons. First of all, he was very kind, very gracious, and very welcoming to my interest over a number of years, and he worked with me on 6 different documentary projects. He obviously is highly regarded for his term as the LDS Church historian, bringing his professional training and a new spirit to the church historian's office. Many researchers consider that a golden era of open access that Arrington fostered because he believed in context and access, providing the best history. It was because of Leonard Arrington that I learned a couple of really important lessons. First, always challenge what exists on face value. Don't accept the shorthand explanation of why something is important, why something is right, or why something is wrong. Seek to understand the basis for that common understanding. Don't just accept it. Challenge it and understand it. He touched my life in a very special way. Last time I interviewed him on the Brigham Young documentary, he slapped me on the back and said, "Be bold, but be careful." And from that standpoint, he wanted me to investigate, to research, not to accept the common knowledge. But he also said, make sure you thoroughly investigate and research, and don't just grab one shred of evidence. Don't just paint with one color. Don't just focus on one characteristic. Work the context. It'll be more meaningful when you do. 2 side stories. Herbert Maw, who I actually loved. Was mentioned in my introduction or written somewhere. I've interviewed, I have the Herbert bookends in my career. I've interviewed and profiled every governor from Herbert Maw to Gary Herbert. Okay, the Herbert bookends and everything in between. And all that experience gives me 2 politicians that I will never forget. I'm grateful for meeting them, knowing them, and listening to the world in their real time. Herbert Maw and Jay Brackenley. And as luck would have it, they despised each other. They ran against each other. Herbert Maw was initially elected in 1940, then he was reelected in 1944, challenged by the maverick upstart mayor of Price, Utah, Jay Brackenley, the Republican. Herbert Maw wins the narrowest election victory in Utah history in 1944. 1948, thank goodness for journalists everywhere, they decide to do it again. Herbert Maw was a very pious man, very proud of his LDS Church lineage, not ashamed to bring that up at every given opportunity to discuss his affiliation. Jay Brackenley, not so much. Jay Brackenley viewed as a maverick, having a laissez-faire attitude towards the administration of liquor and vice laws in the Price Helper area. Whether it was that dichotomy or just the post-war sense of a nation, Brackley defeats Herbert Maw in 1948. Now, 35 years later, I came to know both men, and each man told me this story. Many years after the last election, they met on a wintry afternoon in downtown Salt Lake City. The 2 old adversaries approached each other. One hand was raised in friendship. One spun on their heel and walked away. The beauty of it, both men told me the story. Both men were the one who extended the hand in friendship. And both said, "Can you believe that guy turned and walked away and wouldn't shake my hand?" Political memory. It's a funny, funny thing. If some of I've been jumping all around here. Let me apologize. The racing hand of the clock is now working against me. I haven't mentioned the role of historical research. Like when I did the Skull Valley documentary, I actually held the original treaty document signed by Abraham Lincoln with the Skull Valley Band of the Goshoot Indian tribe from the 1860s, a moment where I literally wept to have that ability to touch history. Of course, I had my white gloves on, but to see that and to see the words sovereignty used in that treaty, which would become very problematic for the administration of laws when it came to the Goshoot tribe being interested in above-ground storage of high-level nuclear waste. History does inform the present day's issues. If some of these stories sound kind of grand, like, I love to tell the story of being chased by internal security in Moscow in the 1980s during the Leonid Brezhnev era, as I was attempting to talk with dissidents for a documentary that I did, and evading them and getting the upper hand and getting the dissidents on camera and telling the story, and then going back just 5 years later and doing open-air shooting of black markets, burgeoning, and dissidents in the Arbat delivering angry poetry because the regime of Mikhail Gorbachev was crumbling. These stories sound kind of grand. I've witnessed one too many executions when I covered Crime and Punishment, and I don't mean to sound like somehow my work is something that I think is elevated above average. I wish I could get every project back and do it again and do it better. If there's one absolute truth about my career, I made mistakes. Mistakes in history and mistakes in television and film production. I learned from those mistakes. The wonder of my career is that all throughout I could find new ways to make mistakes. I'm supposed to portray that as I continued learning until I retired. Actually, I never learned to quite get it right, but I kept learning as I went on. I have benefited immeasurably from the role of people in my career. I've talked about Leonard Arrington. I've talked about David Hayward Bain, the wisdom, experience, and long lens of Howard Lamar, Dean May at the University of Utah, who I held in such high esteem and really invented in Utah the genre of television as a teaching tool through a people's history of Utah, where it was shared in classrooms, touching the lives of tens of thousands of Utahns when they were very, very young, with telling visual stories of Utah's history. I held Dean in very high regard for that. One day, Dean didn't hail me on the university campus. Dean confronted me on the University of Utah campus. He said, "Why haven't you used me in a single one of your documentaries?" And I told him the truth. I said, when you are so singularly known as producing a public school educational teaching aid, where you appear on camera, and it emanates from the University of Utah, I have been afraid to put you on camera from another University of Utah auspices for fear that people would think it was your project and not mine. Now, that's a confession to ego. I admit that. But it also is a statement of personal responsibilities. I am the person responsible for what goes into every second of those programs. I am responsible for the errors. I am responsible for the omissions. If anyone has a problem, they know who to call. And I didn't want that ever to be confused. But I did love Dean May. When I first waded into attempting to tell a clear-eyed story of the practice of plural marriage in the American West, I contacted the Public Affairs Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the church had, their PR staff stopped returning my calls. They were not entirely comfortable with the premise of my piece, which I believe I stated as, since Wilford Woodruff issued the manifesto in 1890, I want to understand why there are still thousands of easily identified practitioners of plural marriage 100 years later in the shadow of the church office building. Silence. Many of whom identify themselves as the true and fulsome followers of Joseph Smith. Increasingly awkward silence. I needed someone extremely well-schooled, regarded, and respected. And it was just good fortune that led me down Interstate 15 into the office of Tom Alexander. Tom not only met with me and sat for an insightful interview that proved to be crucial to the national PBS documentary, A Matter of Principle, he became a source, he became a friend that I would turn to again and again through the years. Always helpful, always generous with his time, always gracious in hearing me out, and in the process helping me hone an approach to subjects as diverse as the underground years of Church President John Taylor, the challenges faced by Wilford Woodruff, and even the mine labor disruptions at the turn of the 20th century. Tom Alexander, always unflinchingly honest, unflinchingly fair, and welcoming to this poor reporter's inquiry. Tom, I remain so grateful. There's an old adage that the winners get to write the history, right? Okay? We slayed your tribe, now we get to tell you how it went. It's an all too frequent occurrence that the person that is the victor gets to write about the vanquished. Brigham Madsen patiently and thoughtfully schooled me in looking beyond simple narratives to truly weigh the lost voices so we could understand the humanity at play in any conflict. An exceptional university professor whose legacy includes the powerful examination of the Bear River Massacre, Brig encouraged me to find other voices. I developed a Brig mantra. Who am I missing? Who do I need to listen to? Similarly, Floyd O'Neill shared the importance of seeking out the marginalized voices of the Utah experience. His many years of teaching at the University of Utah, his seminal role in the American West Center, they're matched by his indefatigable work in telling the stories of pioneering settlement and the impact upon indigenous people. Other voices would vow the Utah experience was somehow gentler and more humane towards the indigenous people. Floyd would continue to remind me and would document the reality of people being subjugated, relegated, and too often forgotten. I'm sorry that Floyd is too ill today to attend this conference because I wanted to tell him once again how important he is to me. Somebody's pointing? Floyd, bless you. Once again, you surprised me, my friend. I could listen for hours to Harold Schindler hold forth. Now, if anybody was ever out of central casting to tell stories of the Old West in Utah, it was Hal Schindler. For years, he started out as a hard-nosed government reporter, then for years was the television and media critic for the Salt Lake Tribune. But he was always passionate about Utah history. He wrote remarkable work on the life of Orrin Porter Rockwell and all of those little stories behind the curtain that were shared at the time that helped me understand elements of the Utah story that didn't find themselves into the neat 3x5 card of what Utah was about. Hal, as I said, wrote that book. I had a dog-eared copy of it, took it to an interview I did with him, and I said, Hal, this is my copy of your book, would you sign it? And he looked at it, and it was dog-eared, and I scribbled all the way through it, and I highlighted. I have this habit of highlighting everything in yellow, and he looked at it, and he goes, well, somebody read it. And it was the old media critic in Hal Schindler coming out, astonished that someone in television could read, and absolutely perplexed that someone in television would read. Hal was great. I mentioned Howard Lamar. My last visit with Howard Lamar back in New Haven, I was about ready to leave, and he said, before you leave, you know, the very best doctoral student I've ever had lives in Utah. I said, really? Who's that? He said, Mike Quinn, do you know him? I said, yeah. I've been proud to call D. Michael Quinn a friend for almost 30 years, dating back to when I first reached out to him for his work on post-manifesto plural marriage in the documentary A Matter of Principle. Mike Quinn is a man who, by his sheer personal example, has shared powerful life lessons with me. A scholar who's had such a profound impact on me that he has actually trained me to work my way through all of the footnotes in a Mike Quinn manuscript. Those of you who know Mike Quinn's writing know that you get basically one paragraph of content and then 30 pages of a footnote. Mike is a remarkable individual, and all I can say is, when asked by Howard Lamar, I said, yes, I know Mike Quinn, and I'm proud to call him my friend. Here the tributes must end. The irascible, indefatigable Will Bagley, who with David Bigler helped shape my understanding of the Mormon Battalion and the trail from the Midwest through New Mexico up to California to Sutter's Fort, the discovery of gold and back again. A man who loves to tell a great story. And I love listening to him. Max Evans, a previous director of state history, Max taught me one of the most important lessons that any archivist would probably be grateful that I learned. Max, after I had run amok, rushing into print a photo book, a picture book, to accompany Utah, the Struggle for Statehood, Max pulled me aside and said, Ken, just a word of advice going forward. It's always better to ask permission and get release before you publish, rather than come back afterwards and beg for forgiveness. A learning moment with Max Evans, and I'm grateful for that. I have had so many learning moments with state history. I wish Susan Whetstone was here so that I could apologize to her once again for ruining her life for about 15 years. But she was always gracious with my interest. She was always tender and accepting as I asked for just one more photograph. And that brings me to the final opportunity today so I can stay within my allotted time. I was going to do a wide-ranging criticism of the contemporary media, and I'm not going to do that. Well, talk to me on the side. I'll launch into it again. I'm proud. I'm not a filmmaker, and I'm not a historian. I've already apologized for that. I've put it behind me. That's part of my retirement now. And I'm proud to be a journalist. But I readily acknowledge that media is the most self-congratulatory profession in the world. There are so many awards out there that being identified as an award-winning journalist is roughly akin to being identified as a bird with wings. But there is something that I think I've earned, and it's to make some simple requests. We need to ensure that the preservation of our government communication and documentation remains a priority as we move further and further into the digital era. We need to make sure that we allow access to the original sources from the past, well maintained, well cataloged, and available, so we can continue to inform and grace our lives. We need to strengthen the access of the public to public records, not artificially creating barriers of denial, undue cost, or delay. We need to invest as a state and as a nation in creating gathering places to share the stories of the American experience, welcoming, instructive, inclusive places. As much as I advocate for the preservation of historic buildings, as much as I hope the beautiful Rio Grande Depot will serve our state as a public gathering place for many years to come, I hope in my lifetime to see Utah invest in the creation of a special new public gathering place built around a celebration and showcase for the history and the art of this state. Utah history, Utah art, and a Utah showcase. That's what I hope for. That's what we deserve. Here's my benediction to you. Civil, not sacred. I bless you in your investigation. I pray for you when the obstacles and the denials are daunting. I promise to stand with you in spirit during those long hours of lonely research. I hope you will always be rewarded with your own aha moment, the golden moment of discovery and insight. And above all, I remind you that everything you do today is a gift to an unborn generation. I talked about the less important gifts that have been visited upon a journalist, the awards, the statues, the certificates. Beyond those, there have been moments of wonder during this career, moments when unsung Americans have shared their stories, mindful their sacrifice could be forgotten. None more poignant than an interview I did in Berkeley, California with a resident of the Central Utah War Relocation Center. The interview had been wrenching, tearful, and very emotional. In it, this woman talked of Topaz and moments she had not discussed since 1945. At 16, the nation of her birth had placed her in a camp in Utah designed to gather under guard a targeted demographic so they could be controlled in a time of war. American citizens whose only commonality was their ethnicity. She lingered over these words. I was in an American concentration camp. As we finished, a daughter entered the room where we were seated. She'd apparently been listening to the interview in the dark. She stepped into the television lights, stepped up to her mother. She had never heard these stories before. With tears streaming down her face, she embraced her mother, said, Mom, I never knew. And so what we share today in this gathering, in this setting, is an irrevocable conviction. We are richer when we know. We are wiser when we know. We are more capable to act when we know. And so, my friends, know we must. I'm so very grateful for having had the opportunity afforded by this career. So very grateful to be blessed by so many historians who shared their time, their thought, their energies with me. I'm one grateful retired old man. Just as I'm grateful for this opportunity today. Thank you.